I am extremely pleased to be able to moderate this afternoon's program and discussion with President Goodluck Jonathan, who is our special guest here this afternoon. President Goodluck Jonathan has been closely involved in two of Africa's most important recent elections. One as a candidate in his own country in March of this year, and just 1 month ago as the head of the Commonwealth election monitoring mission in Tanzania. President Jonathan is here this afternoon to share his insights and observations on both of those very important democratic elections. But before I give him an opportunity to speak, let me say a bit more about President Goodluck Jonathan and the important role that he has played in strengthening the democratic process in his own country, and also elevating the standard of comportment and behavior of African presidents in elections across the continent. President Goodluck Jonathan has had a long and distinguished career in public service at the state and the federal level. He served as deputy governor and later as governor of Bayelsa State, as Dr. Firmunio has pointed out, before becoming a vice presidential candidate and becoming vice president in 2007. Following the untimely death of his predecessor, the late President Umar Yar'Adua, in May of 2010, President Jonathan, in accordance with the Nigerian Constitution, became head of state. In 2011, President Jonathan ran for the presidency and won in what most Nigerians in the international community called Nigeria's best elections since independence in 1960. And on March 28th of this year, President Goodluck Jonathan ran for the presidency a second time, but lost. But unlike in many countries where sitting presidents have been defeated at the ballot box, Nigeria did not fall into crisis. And unlike some defeated African presidents, he made no attempt to change the outcome, to cling to power, or to stall the democratic transition. President Jonathan put democracy, Nigeria's constitution, and the people of his own country before his own interests and desires. President Jonathan acted with dignity and with honor. And like leaders from other democratic countries around the world, including our own, he accepted defeat, conceded gracefully, and moved quickly to publicly congratulate his successor. President Jonathan's actions have earned him well-deserved praise from his fellow citizens, as well as people around the world who believe fervently in democracy, constitutional governance, and free and fair elections. President Jonathan's actions were even more significant because Nigeria is not just another African country. Nigeria is Africa's most important country, economically, politically, and and strategically. And because of President Jonathan's actions, many people recognize that the commitment to free, fair, and transparent elections in Africa's largest democracy is becoming deeper and stronger, not weaker and more fragile. Thus, it is not surprising that the Commonwealth selected President Jonathan to lead its election observation mission to Tanzania, a country with a growing democratic tradition, but one which was facing a highly contested election. Tanzania's elections have resulted in some political hiccups on Zanzibar, but President Jonathan's leadership in helping that country has been praised by outside observers. President Jonathan still has some work to do in Tanzania, but given his strong personal commitment to democracy and to fairness, I'm sure we will see him leading other election monitoring efforts in the future. But this afternoon, we are privileged to have President Goodluck Jonathan with us to talk about the recent elections in Nigeria, his own country, but also his observation and insights on the Tanzanian election, where he has spent some time. We also hope to hear a few of his thoughts about the state of democracy across Africa, a subject of intense discussion and debate by scholars and commentators, not only in the United States, but in other countries where democracy is valued. I'll stop here. I'm going to sit back down, allow President Goodluck Jonathan to make some opening remarks, and then we will engage in a dialogue that will also include you in the audience. But I'd like all of you to join me in giving President Goodluck Jonathan a very warm welcome to the National Conference.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'll start by letting you provide some opening comments. I do have a number of questions that I'd like to ask, and I'm sure there are many in the audience who have questions as well.
Thank you, Carson. First, let me sincerely thank NDI and the Center of Strategic and International Studies for hosting me to this gathering. And let me sincerely appreciate all of you for finding time to come. When I came in, I saw the audience, that these are not ordinary people, but people who really want to solve problems of the world, want to know what is happening in Africa and the role they will play. So on behalf of continent of Africa, let me appreciate all of you for this evening. And for Carson, it's a pleasure meeting you again.
Yeah.
I'm quite pleased to be here. In fact, ordinarily, you're supposed to be the key speaker. You're more conversant with the issues, at least from a neutral point. I am an insider, so there's a feeling that you may be a bit biased. And that is why it would have a little too early for me, because when I left office 29th of May this year, my thinking was that it will take a minimum of 1 year before I'll comment on even the elections in Nigeria. And of course, for the Tanzanian election too, it's quite sensitive because we still have problems in Zanzibar. And again, I'm a part of the process of seeing how we resolve this crisis. So there are certain things you can't say now. Otherwise, the people there may think that you are biased in one way or the other. So it's quite sensitive for me. The ambassador is here and you'll be listening to me. So, but we'll try to have a little conversation. And I believe I will do more when I will respond to your questions than what I will really say. Of course, you've been told I've played active politics for a period of 16 years in Nigeria. 16 years is quite a short time. Looking at, take America for example, some of the congressmen have been there upward of 20 years. So 16 years is small, but somehow within these 16 years, just like my friend mentioned, I moved from a deputy governor of my state, became the governor of the state, the vice president and the president. So for 8 years, I was at the state level handling local problems. For another 8 years, I was at the center, looking at national problems, African problems, and of course, international problems. So combining the 8 years, I've been sufficiently informed about African issues. And of course, why we're here, Carson didn't mention, we're here because I'm thinking that I should set up a little foundation to link up with other institutions and individuals to see how we can contribute to the growth of democracy in Africa, to consolidate what is there, and also issues about youth employment. My emphasis is that how we encourage young people to create jobs for themselves. They should be CEOs of their own companies, not just looking for jobs. We started that in Nigeria and was quite successful, but that will be a discussion for another day. Today we are talking about Africa elections. Specifically, we're using maybe Nigeria and Tanzania as case studies. If you look at Africa generally, of course, I always tell people that when I was in elementary school, up to when I was in high school, up to my earlier days in college, Africa was regarded as a dark continent. So from day one, there's some kind of negative perception about Africa. When America was discovered, it was announced that the new world, America was looked at as a world, not just a continent, not talk about a country, and America is still the world. So you can see the visions, contrasting concepts. So for Africa, over the period, yes, we have challenges, but if you look at it, we are progressing significantly, but in most cases, probably we are not moving as fast as we're supposed to move in terms of consolidating democracy and other issues. We may not be moving as fast as, but to me, there's significant progress. Even within this short space of time that I've been the president of Nigeria for these 5 years, there's significant progress, especially in this West African region that was a key actor. Also, you know that most of these African states, in terms of elections, a very, very recent history. Most African countries were under colonial rule, and most of them gained independence between 1960 plus or minus 5 years. I say plus or minus because, of course, slave trade ended 1807. Then the first African country to gain independence was Liberia in 1847. Because Liberia was the only American colony anyway, and Americans were not interested in colonizing countries. So Liberia gained independence in 1947. I think the first set of African countries that gained independence after Liberia were 1956. Countries like Tunisia, Sudan, then 1957 countries like Ghana. Of course, then we came to Nigeria, it's about 1960, Nigeria and Cameroon, Nigeria Republic about 1960, 61, 62, maybe Kenya about 63, Tanzania 62. Of course, Gambia is about 65, and Uganda and Uganda is about 62 too. Of course, Zambia and Malawi about 64. The Gambia 65, and of course the late entries are Zimbabwe 1980, as recent as 1980. So you see that between 1960 plus or minus 5 years, this time most of these countries gained independence and started to practice democracy. These are nations where they have so many kingdoms within, unlike the Arab states, where they had kingdoms that have been running their affairs at the beginning. In these other African countries, within the country, you have so many kingdoms, so it's not a question of just one king ruling. If we had nations where just one king ruling, it would have been easier, but would have been used to the dominance of one person. So it's a complex society. Countries like Nigeria pass through military interventions. We have checkered political history. It's very recent, 1999, that we're having a stable system. We gained independence in 1960. By 1967, the military struck, and the First Republic was gone. There was a series of military interventions up to 1979, when the Second Republic came up. Shagari was elected as the president. Served 4 years, 3 years into his second term in 1983, the military struck. Then we attempted in the 90s, 93, and so on. Before we conducted presidential election, of course, presidential election was being conducted when Abiola was winning the annual election. Then, of course, we started in 1999. So it's from 1999 that we're beginning to see some kind of stable system. Obasanjo was elected in 1999, NDI were fully involved, and he was elected in 1999. 2003, he ran for a second term, and at least he won, and still for 8 years. 2007, when I contested as vice president to the late president, Yar'Adua. Of course, Yar'Adua died. Everybody thought that Nigeria was going to slip back into military dictatorship, but somehow I took over. I was inaugurated as a full president. Then I contested 2011, and I won. Of course, 2015. There's a change of battle. Even from a ruling political party that ran the affairs of the country for almost 16 years to another party. So we're stabilizing, and most other countries, Ghana is stable, Senegal, and others. Yes, we still have few gray areas, but I believe I used to tell people that in the next 10 years or so, the whole system will be very stable. We are worried about some countries, city president wanting to extend their tenures. And those countries that try to change the constitution to change their tenures from 2 tenures that most countries practice to another 3rd tenure, so on. Some countries, the presidents have succeeded, some no. And it has to do with the weakness of the parliament. Countries that the parliaments are very strong. Obasanjo wanted to come up, of course, you know, about his 3rd tenure. We were Obasanjo boys when I was the governor of Nigeria. But we have a very strong parliament, and the parliament refused. Of course, if you see what happened in Burkina Faso, then I was still the president. Blaise Compaoré wanted to extend his tenure by another tenure. We advised against it, but from the security information we got, I was telling some of my friends, remember myself, president of Ghana, president of Ghana, president of Senegal, one of the ECOWAS meetings. So we advised against it, that look, we may have security challenges in our hands in ECOWAS. Please finish the 2 tenures and leave. I say, no, we want the extension, we'll follow the legal process and due process is fine. He followed the process quite right. He made the draft of the amendment of the Constitution to make provision for a 3rd term. The Parliament, because they have a very weak Parliament, the Parliament agreed and passed it. So pure legally, it was handled properly. He didn't impose himself. But the weakness of the Parliament, but the society did not agree. So the revolution that came up, the protest from civil society and youth groups was against the president and the parliament. The president couldn't stay. He has to run away from the country to Côte d'Ivoire. Of course, the Speaker of Parliament ran away from the country. And they burned down the parliamentary building down. So that if they see the Speaker, they were going to kill him. So when that crisis was on our hand, myself, again, the president of Ghana, president of Senegal, we had to go to Côte d'Ivoire. No, sorry, Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, to resolve that crisis. And we had problems on our hands because their constitution says, because they don't have a vice president, in the absence of the president, there's the Speaker of Parliament that takes over. This is a case where both president and the Speaker have run away, and there was nobody to take over based on the constitution of the country. The law we have, I used to tell people that their constitution, the Francophone countries have different constitution than compared to the Anglophone countries in West Africa. I don't know the rest of Africa. In the Anglophone countries, we follow the English law strictly, so their constitution does not make that kind of provision. But in their own case, if there is something that's not clearly defined in the constitution, like this kind of lacuna, they have what they call the Constitutional Court, which is almost like a parallel court to the Supreme Court, but only handle constitutional issues. the Constitutional Court can take a decision, and that decision becomes a law. So we had to have a conversation with the President of the Constitutional Court that advice a letter be written to them, because a letter was sent to them. This is this problem, advice. They now advise on the interim government, and that becomes a law. So, but now, it's that even this country is going to be very stable, because there was a military attempt to take over, and the people registered. And the civilians who have gone back to, they were to do their elections in November, but probably because of that military issue, they may do it in December. So I'm saying that if you look at Africa generally, though we are not moving as fast as people will expect us to move, but the elections are getting better. Democracy is being institutionalized. I just came back from Tanzania, and I will thank and praise the people of Tanzania. The elections were very credible. Just like you mentioned, I was involved in 1999. Before that time, I was involved in politics from outside. From 1999, I contested the elections in Nigeria. Not just an ordinary election, but that of the deputy governor of my state. And of course, the Nigerian constitution, the deputy governor and the governor, they are paired, just like the vice president and president. It was a ticket election. So I contested that election. 2003, I contested again with my governor. 2007, I contested as the vice president with Yaradua. 2011, I contested as the president, where I presided over the country and still contested, and of course 2015 also. So when I went to Tanzania and I looked at the quality of election, I was quite impressed, very, very impressed. Even the activities, because for observation, international observation of election, it's not what happened on that day alone that matters. The activities that led to the elections, in terms of registration of voters, how was the voters' registration conducted? Was it done in a way that some segment of society was not captured, thereby disemphasizing those people from participating in the electoral process? That is key. How was the conversation in terms of political campaigns, government media, government control media, and so on? How do they manage their affairs? Were some people disadvantaged? Are all people given the opportunity to use the public media to advocate their own ideas and so on? Then, of course, what happened in the election day proper in terms of voting, tallying, and counting votes at the polling units? Then the post-election, coordinating the results from the polling units up to, for presidential election, up to the national level, declaration of results, and so on and so forth. So, those were very good. We observed up to the time I was personally involved. I went to so many polling stations. People went to quietly tally the election. What we couldn't even do in Nigeria, what I observed in Tanzania, in some of the polling units, if you are representing Party A, I'm representing Party B. After sorting out the ballot papers, I will carry the ballot paper from Party B that I'm representing. I give you to count. And you will count. I observed that in Tanzania. I was quite impressed. And you, representing Party A, will count those who voted for me. And we record it. So there was maximum cooperation. I saw a country that has advanced democratically. Well, we didn't really follow up in terms of clear observation of what happens between the results at the polling unit up to the collation and elections were declaration of election. That I cannot comment much because I was not, although we made a little observation in some places. The only weakness the electoral process in Tanzania has, and that's even the question of Commonwealth, I can say so, because even in 2010, that is the selection of Commonwealth, was that the presidential elections in Tanzania, you don't challenge it in courts. So whatever result the electoral body declare, it's taking it as a scriptural injunction. Unlike most other countries like Nigeria that can challenge presidential elections in court and make a case. That is the only weakness I saw there. So if they're assuming you are not happy, assuming you suspect that something has been done that is not quite acceptable, immediately it's announced. For presidential election, for parliamentary election, you can go to court. But for presidential election, I believe they are considering the safety of the country. You don't go to court. In Zanzibar, what happened? First, I will not say much because we still want to go back and see how we'll solve the problem. Zanzibar has 54 constituencies within Zanzibar. And at the end of the election, so we had two teams, because Zanzibar is made up of so many small islands, but there's only two islands that are occupied by people. We have two teams in these islands and other international observers. And the observation we had was the same observation others had, because after all the observation, all the international observers came together to share experiences before we released our own interim statements, because we didn't want to say that, oh, maybe Commonwealth is saying one thing, EU is saying another thing, AU is saying something else, the East Africa will be saying one thing, South Africa is saying another thing. So we wanted to see if there are gray areas. We wanted to resolve those gray areas among ourselves so that the communication will be very, very clear. And from all the reports we had, we were all comfortable. We had, in terms of communication, yes, different, but all we agreed on all the things. In Zanzibar, out of the 53 constituencies, the electoral body, the Zanzibar Electoral Commission, announced the results of 31 of these constituencies. After some time, the chairman now annulled the results of all the constituencies. And that's where we now have problems. And we felt they raised issues of malpractices in the remaining constituencies. The international observers' position then, it was not my personal position, was that look, if you have already announced the results of 31, it's better for you to repeat the elections in the constituencies that you have not declared the results. But the Electoral Commission felt that one of the issues they raised was that by virtue of their constitution, it's only the Zanzibar Electoral Commission that can announce the result of elections. Of course, that's the position in most countries. As an observer or as a candidate or as a political party, you cannot announce the result. You can only collate based on the report from your agent, but you don't have legal power to announce the result. But even before the collation was still going on, the opposition party announced that they have won the presidential election with 54%. That was against the constitution of Zanzibar. Definitely, it was against the constitution of Zanzibar. But it was a delicate issue. So the Zanzibar Electoral Commission felt that that infraction, coupled with the fact that they are malpractice, that they will annul the whole elections and go back to a fresh election. But the opposition said, look, the international observers have said that elections are free and fair. That's the problem we have, that you must announce all the results. So that is the stalemate, but that is only in Zanzibar. It does not affect the overall elections in the country. For those of you who know Tanzania very well, the ambassador is here, and my good friend Carson is very conversant. Zanzibar is a union government. You have the bigger part, the mainland, the original Tanganyika. Then, of course, Zanzibar, the island, and they come together to form the union. And the structure of the government is that Zanzibar, that's about 1.1 million people. They have their own president. They have their own parliament. Then they have their local councils. Then the overall country, they have the overall president, they have the overall parliament. So the day that we conducted this election, in the mainland, we are voting for the president, they voted for the president, they voted for the overall parliament, they voted for the local council elections. But in Zanzibar, they also voted for the overall president, the overall parliament, but in addition, they were voting for the president of Zanzibar, the parliament of Zanzibar, and the local council in Zanzibar. So we had 3 elections in the mainland, but 5 elections in Zanzibar. And these elections are carried out in the same polling unit. But somehow the results for the overall president was announced because the election took place in the same unit. The result for the overall parliaments were announced because they took place in the same unit. So it's only the elections that are related to Zanzibar alone that were annulled. So people were feeling that if you could accept these other ones, since the elections took place, the same people monitored, the same electoral officers worked, we should announce the whole result. So that's the problem we have. But I didn't want to say more in terms of what I think or what I don't think or what I believe or what I don't believe, because I am meant to participate in the negotiation. So I must be seen to be extremely neutral. And this matter, what the ambassador will help us here. But on the overall, I think Tanzania did very well. The quality of elections was very high. The issues of corruption following elections, we did not observe that. It's one country that, unlike most other countries, including Nigeria, during campaigns, sometimes you produce gift items for people, you produce biro pens, you produce handkerchiefs, you produce cups and things like that, and you think you are doing it, but in Tanzania you don't do that, because it's considered as inducing the electorate. So the only thing that candidates do is to work with their political parties to provide vests, singlets, and flags for their youths and women to wear. That is the only thing, and provide vehicles, transport people to venues for campaigns and so on. You don't give anything. Most other countries give certain things, and it's considered as accepted by the practice, not necessarily guided by any law. So it was a transparent. I really commend the people. So for Nigeria, of course, I didn't want to say much, because everybody knows the elections in 1999, people were not too happy. Yes, I won. We won the election. I contested with my governor, we won. But we were not too happy. 2003, people were not too happy again. In fact, 2007, which I can talk authoritatively, because I contested that election as a vice president, and myself and the president ran as a ticket. We won, no doubt about that. The matter went to court. We had 3 layers of superior courts. We're not talking about magistrate and customary courts. We have Nigerian practice, you have the High Court, you have the Appeal Court, and you have the Supreme Court. For presidential elections, only the Appeal Court and the Supreme Court are listed. When the matter went to the Appeal Court, I can't remember the differences, but I know what happened in the Supreme Court. In Nigerian Supreme Court, 7 justices must sit and listen to every sensitive matter. And simple majority takes, in most cases, even the justices themselves don't agree. Out of the 7 justices that sat over our elections in 2007, 3 said that the elections should be annulled. 4 said that the elections should not be annulled. Very narrow. That shows clearly that those elections were not very good. They were not very good. Otherwise, there's no way 3 justices would say that the election will be annulled, and only 4 say. That was happened in 2007. Yes, I benefited. I contested one as the vice president. But immediately after that election, my president then set up a committee to see how we sanitize the electoral process so that we don't get into this kind of controversies again. But somehow he couldn't stay to midwife that to the end. He became ill, and of course he knew I took over. When I was to contest 2011, I said that we must begin to conduct transparent elections, credible elections, free and fair elections. We did our best, just like Carson said. Both international observers, that was the first time international observers said that, and local observers said that elections were properly done in Nigeria. Of course, in Nigeria, when you lose the election, you must go to court. The matter went to court again. In the appeal court, the 5 justices that sat over the matter, 5 of them said that the elections were free and fair, that the opposition had no say. They went to Supreme Court. The 7 justices say that same thing. So that could tell you the story. So if you compare that and 2007, both elections are benefited. You see that the difference there. So I believe that we are progressing as a continent. Even in the Nigerian case, it's getting better. Every election must have their own issues. The immediate past elections, we had issues, the issues of the car reader. There were issues that if I'm not the kind of person who want the country to move forward, I could have gone to court to challenge it. Because the car reader that were introduced with malfunctioned. So in some states, in some parts, car readers were used for the accreditation. In some places, car readers were not used. So you conducted the election that was not based on the same standard. And every election, the key thing in election is that it's ordinarily supposed to be based on the same standard. But those issues must come up in electoral, especially in developing nations. But I felt that the country was quite tense. And we must move forward as a country, we must move forward as a continent. And that issues of leadership. I always advise people, if you want to go for a runoff election, if you lose the election, leave. If you are wrongly voted out, if you are still interested, not me, you can go back and try your luck again. It has been happening. And if people felt that, oh, they voted for you, voted you out wrongly, yes, of course, they will compare you, especially at the level of the president of the country. They will compare you with whoever comes, and after some time, you can go back if you want to. To me, I have served, I think it's enough. But that is my own advice. So it's not whether the elections were credible or not credible. That's why probably the Tanzania style is good. That the presidential election, immediately you announce the result, everybody should go and sleep. So I have to thank you because I've been told that we have no time again. So
Well, let me
listen to some of the issues you raised, and yes, we'll do our best to have this conversation. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
We got another
30 minutes.
yeah, we should.
Okay. Mr. President, thank you very, very much for a very comprehensive and thoughtful set of remarks about both Tanzania and Nigeria and where you think democracy is going. Let me start off by asking two questions. One with respect to the larger Africa, one with respect to Nigeria. In terms of Africa today, we do see a number of leaders around the continent. In particular, we see it in Rwanda, we see it in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we see it in Congo-Brazzaville, we've seen it in Burundi, where indeed presidents have altered or are attempting to alter the constitutions that they've been operating on for what appears to be their own personal desires. What can former African presidents like yourself, who have been through the democratic process and respected, do to help to convince those African leaders that they run a high risk of generating instability in their countries if they alter the current political processes? We see what's happening in Burundi today, for example, highly contested. It could happen in other places as well. But what is it that presidents like yourself, who recognize the need for free and fair elections and for constitutions to work, what can you do? Second question is a Nigeria-focused question. And you mentioned the card scanners or the card readers and the voter verification documents. Would you recommend that other African countries move in the same direction as Nigeria has done in terms of introducing modern electronic technology in being able to verify voter registration and accreditation? You said that it was uneven, but would you pull it back at this point, or would you move forward with perfecting it?
Thank you. I'll try to be brief because of time. First, the issue of what I can do, myself representing other African leaders, because in fact, that is what brought me to the United States of America. I've been here for 2 weeks. I've been in discussions with various people. I've stayed in a number of the presidential museums, libraries, presidential precinct in Virginia. We're discussing Qatar. And so all the conversation is, I told them that, look, former African leaders must come out. Because you've been a president before, so you can have a conversation with any sitting president. And it is this crop of people that should be able to impress on sitting presidents, sometimes not even their colleagues, to see that we must follow democratic tenets and standards, the global best practices. And that's what I'm offering myself to do. I'm setting up the Goodluck Jonathan Foundation. I believe by middle next year, we'll really start and see the little role we can play in stabilizing democracies in Africa. We have a great thing we can do. But the story, as I've told you before, too, is improving. As you mentioned, these gray areas. There are other countries that are attempted to extend their tenure, like I talked about Nigeria, didn't succeed because of the strength of the parliament. For that of Burkina Faso, it was a negative thing because the parliament caved in, but the society against it. But if I used to tell people that sometimes the good stories about Africa is not told. Macky Sall, the current president of Senegal, is a good example. We are getting more vibrant young leaders that don't believe that a president is a king, that they believe a president has a tenure, and when your tenure is over, you must leave. When Professor Wade is 70-something years old, when he was the president, he amended the constitution of Senegal. It was a 5 years tenure, and you can run double tenure, maximum 10 years, that 2 tenures, 10 years. President Wade, when he was to run his second tenure, even though he was 70 plus, he amended the constitution to make provision for a president to stay 7 years. So, because he was too sure as a sitting president was going to win. So if he had won, he would have stayed for 7 years. But unfortunately, Macky Sall won the election. But Macky Sall won the election based on a constitution that has a provision for 7 years. But Macky Sall said, no, one person cannot sit here for 14 years. It's too long. So though he would have benefited from that 7 years, but he amended the constitution again, reverted back to the original 5 years term. See, so that is a good story. So the things are changing. Some of the African leaders probably passed through a lot of struggle. We talk about Zimbabwe that just gained independence in 1980. And most of them passed through chains of struggle. So they still see their nations as little empires, that they are the leaders and so on. They are yet to see themselves as elected president of the people. So we still have these few countries where people want to stay for long. But the story is changing very drastically. And I believe in another 10 years or so, we'll not be talking about president not wanting to leave. We'll be talking about core economic issues. How will African nations move away from this concept of developing nations to upper second world nations or near first world nations like Singapore and other Asian tigers have done. I'm very, very hopeful. In case of Nigeria, yes, I use that as an example. That I mentioned that because for every election, if people want to go to court, you will have a number of reasons that you will go to court. I will not say because we had issues with the car reader in Nigeria and that other countries should not. The purpose of technology is to solve human problems. But somehow the way you use technology and your understanding of technology matters. Probably the people were not sufficiently trained, or even we played the order to acquire the car readers. Maybe there was not enough time, so some of them have factory problems, and Nigeria is a very big country. The use of car reader for the purpose of, because it's in computer that they use for the registration of voters. A nation must move away from manual way of doing things to IT. You cannot run away from that. Even in Tanzania, they were using OMR before to register voters, but they also now migrated to using biometric, because the card reader and that biometric registration helps you to capture, if it is properly done. You will not see somebody registering here as a registered voter and going some other place and also registering as a registered voter. You must stop that. That is the very first thing you must do to clean up people who do double registration. So I will advocate that African countries must use, you must use technology, you must use the IT. But if you must use biometric, because in Tanzania, though they use biometric registration, they did not use car readers. They just use that to develop the voters' registers. Every other thing is now done. If you move away from electronic, Nigeria, we didn't do electronic voting per se, because that is the ultimate. But electronic voting is more, if you look at the way young people play with IT, you're always afraid somebody will say and point a button and the figures that will appear there will be different, because IT is good and also you have to be careful. carried ordinarily is a very good thing. But if you must use it, you must take sufficient time to learn, prepare, make sure that all of them don't have default based on the factory manufacturer. It is good to use. But what I'm saying that if it is to be used, then it must be uniform. Our own, because Nigeria, we have about one, it's not as big as America. Of course, America is cannot compare, but it's a big country, about 180 million people. So it's not easy. And these machines were acquired too close to the elections. So I believe that is why we had the issue. But I just use that as an example. I'm not saying that we should discredit the election because of that. So that if you want to go to court, there are reasons one would have gone to court and say this and say that and say that. But I felt that no, the interests of my country, the future of my young people, is more important than struggling to continue to be president of one country. People must have different ways, they must serve their people and the rest of the world.
Mr. President, I'm going to open this up to the floor because we've got a limited amount of time. One of our co-sponsors here is Dr. Jennifer Cook, who's at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm going to give her the first opportunity to ask a question. But we're going to take 3 questions and then interrupt it. Jennifer.
No, she's not to ask questions because she's quite conversant with her. She's just give us her own perspective.
Well, I will start with a comment because you know, you got a lot of credit for the phone call and the concessionary phone call, and I have to say, after coming back from observing the elections and hearing that, that was just such a boost after such an impressive electoral process. But I do want to say, because people do forget, and it was Professor Jaga who made this point, that you as a president will, in history, should remember you as someone who supported democracy really from the get-go. We know the shambolic elections in 2003 and 2007. Professor Jaga, when he spoke at CSIS, said not only the appointment, but the fact that you allowed the INEC the space. He said that getting the resources required when needed was never a problem. The peace summit prior, where you and now President Buhari came together, that was hugely important. So I do want to say it wasn't just in leaving that you are a friend of Nigerian democracy, and I think you know, you deserve a great deal of credit for that. I've observed elections since 2003 in Nigeria. Even the really bad ones, I come away inspired. Nigerian voters, you know, show up in such incredible numbers. Civil society, since that time, has grown much more sophisticated, much more vocal. The smart count and the parallel vote count that NDI helps support as well is something I think and a model that other African countries, including Zanzibar, I think most recently has kind of used it as a support to the democratic process. There's the youth corporates, there's so much that is so inspiring in Nigeria. But democracy is more than just the elections, and here's kind of my question, my comment, and maybe for your, in your future endeavors on democracy. Nigeria also has an incredibly free press. They can be very annoying and frustrating.
The freest in Africa.
They can be partisan, but there's press freedom in Nigeria in a way that not a lot of other African countries have it to that extent. There are not public order laws. There are not public defamation laws that are used to the extent that they are in other countries. So there's a whole lot of other things that make a strong democracy than an election or an electoral commission. And you know, we're seeing in places that Ambassador Carson mentioned, not just changing the Constitution, but laws, whether it's in security or cybersecurity or public order or media or NGO laws is a particularly alarming one, that are really chipping away at, you know, they're legal, but they're chipping away at what it fundamentally means to be a democracy. And so I wonder if you might comment on that, where your effort. ECOWAS has been a little bit more forward than some of the other regions on this. But kind of where do you build a real African-wide constituency to push those issues at a very high level would be my question. And then my exhortation.
Can we take a, we'll take about 3 if we could, Mr. President, because otherwise we, Sarah, you, please, as I say, identify yourself as you ask your question. We're going over here to the red.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Prey. I work for the Open Society Foundation. First of all, thank you for your commitment to use your position to promote democracy. That's fantastic to hear. Jennifer mentioned ECOWAS. Nigeria has helped make ECOWAS the strongest regional economic community, and really it has been so useful in stopping a lot of sort of democratic crises in the region. Unfortunately, the African Union hasn't been able to play that similar role, and I'm wondering if you could comment on what it would take to get the African Union to the strong position that I hope it can get to, where it will speak ahead of elections with truth, will observe elections with credibility, and be able to comment and, you know, have those tough conversations when the elections aren't credible. Unfortunately, too often we see kind of a whitewashing of what happens. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
We'll take a third one, all the way back in the,
I got the mic, sorry.
You got the mic.
I already got it, I stole it.
You stole it, okay.
Hi,
Is this a civilian?
Yeah, I brought the mic with me, actually. Yeah. My name is Shavana Grady. I'm a reporter at Foreign Policy Magazine. I think we'd all agree that in addition to fair elections, we can't have corruption if we're going to have fair democracies. And just this week, your national security advisor was accused of stealing $2 billion from the fund to fight Boko Haram. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to comment on that and the $148 billion other dollars that President Buhari thinks went missing in the past decade.
That's why you stole mine.
Since a media presence.
No, I think she, Mr. President, she was doing just what some of those aggressive newspaper reporters do in Nigeria.
Okay, briefly, because I have to thank you because your contributions, I think, is more than the question you asked, actually. Yeah, just concurring because maybe you want to know in terms of the key thing is what we will do.
Well, what you might do with your foundation in terms of building that Pan-African constituency.
Yes, what the question you asked is similar to, but identical to what you also asked. Yes, the foundation will key into that, but you spoke about the media. When I was the president, I signed the Freedom of Information law. I made a law to give a reasonable freedom, so that just like the question a lady asked, you can ask, you can be able to ask the president. But sometimes the media will misuse these laws, and they exploit these laws to go beyond the level. That is, I mean, freedom of information does not give you the powers to libel people, but sometimes they go on. But for Nigeria, because it's a very, very resilient nation, and I agree with you that in Nigeria we accommodate a number of sources, especially from the social media. Most other countries, the number of laws are coming up that you get a bit worried, whether they are gagging freedom and so on, because maybe presidents will want to protect, because it's Nigeria, America is reasonably free. There are some of the things people write that you find it very absurd. And some of the statements that even people, very senior people make are also absurd. But in a nation, well, you have to accommodate it where necessary, you explain. Where it is not necessary, you ignore. Well, the key thing is I want to work with other leaders, ECOWAS level, at AU level, and of course sitting heads of states and former, to see how we could help to strengthen democratic institutions in Africa. Because that is key. The institutions must be strengthened. For you to conduct credible elections, your electoral body must also be strengthened. You just give an example of Jiga, because I strengthened the INEC. That is even the first point of fighting corruption, just like the issue, maybe I'll divert to that before I come to the AU issue. Because for you to fight corruption in any nation, corruption is not a human being that you pick a gun and fire, and it drops dead, and corruption disappears. For you to fight corruption, you must strengthen institutions. The greatest problem we have is that if people come to be elected as leaders, and they were not democratically elected, yes, you may have something I describe as pseudo-democracy, but if the votes of the electorate doesn't matter, you manipulate the system and become a governor, become a president, you can't do anything you like, and that creates impunity. That is the worst form of corruption, and I said that that must go. So first we sanitized the electoral process, created a credible electoral body, and that is why 2011, I sat as a sitting president, and what I was doing, some people said, Mr. President, you may fail this election. That was 2011 even. I said, I prefer to fail the election than to be seen that I'm elected, that people will begin to question whether I was elected by my people. If I'm not elected by the people, I have no business sitting over the affairs of the people. Luckily, that election was regarded as one of the best elections. In fact, the best election in Nigeria from 1960 to that. See, that is my own position around the philosophy. So for me, just like the lady who asked about the corruption, that is the very first thing. I set up institutions to fight corruption. The agri sector was messed up with corruption in terms of fertilizer procurement, agri inputs, and so on. We clean up that system, and nobody talks about corruption. We introduced electronic wallet, and farmers directly get. I was to completely deregulate the petroleum sector that everybody was talking about the corruption. The very few people who are talking about corruption, I said, look, we must now deregulate. So all these corruptions they are talking about will be a thing of the past. They ganged up against me and instigated civil society and some groups. And I couldn't do what I was to do. But coming to the figures you mentioned, because we don't have time, sometimes I feel sad when people mention these figures. In the Nigerian political history, the issue of corruption is now a political and a key thing for campaigns. I just told you that we gained independence in 1960. 1967, the military struck, and what they said, politicians were corrupt. That was the reason they used. And one military government will take over from the other one, and always they are corrupt, they are corrupt, they are corrupt. We got a second republic, 79. By 1983, they came and said all the politicians were corrupt. Some of them were jailed 300 years, 200 years. Of course, this will later on were brought out. So the issue of corruption and the figures are here. When the president paid a state visit to the US, the official visit to the US, there are some figures that were mentioned that I don't believe in. That we have $150 billion. Well, I didn't say my government, but previous administration. I said, you keep $150 billion American money, and Americans should not know where that money is. $150 billion, not $150 billion naira. There may be issues, but not the figures. I mean, if you talk about $2 billion contract, well, the matters are in court. I did not award any contract of $2 billion for procurement of weapons. There's no way somebody will have, where did the money come from? I did not award the contracts of $2 billion for the procurement of weapons. These because I remember there was a time when people tried to play politics with very serious issues. It really came from somebody who was supposed to be a more serious person. Oh, there was one $59.8 billion was missing. $59.8 billion within 12 months. How possible? I remember when I went for one of these meetings with Africa and EU, and I was having bilateral talks with the Chancellor of Germany, and I said, Your Excellency, maybe for Germany, $59.8 billion is very small money in Nigeria. If you lose $59.8 billion in a year, federal government and state governments will not pay salaries. They will not, if we're going to find out, they will not pay salaries. That's how much is the budget of Nigeria. And as you say, you miss that kind of money. Of course, we brought international audit firms, forensic auditors, and they don't see all this. So, I don't want to, because a new government has just taken over the issues. We are talking all kinds of things. That's why I wanted to keep away from the public for at least 12 months. Let these issues be properly filtered by the courts and so on. Finally, we get the results. Of course, one of the statements the president made in the US, of course, you journalists, as a journalist, picked is that ministers were stealing 1 million barrels of crude oil a day. I don't want to join issues with my president. I don't want anybody to report me. But the Nigerian's OPEC quota is 2.25 million barrels. 2.25 million barrels per day. That is our OPEC quota. That's the amount. That's what we produce in a day. Because of some of the crises and sometimes because of human errors and so on, we have problems with the production facilities. Sometimes we don't produce up to 2 million. Quite a number of days we don't even produce up to 2 million barrels. But the maximum, which we hardly, is 2.25 million barrels. 1 million is 50% of that. It's difficult for you to say somebody will steal 1 million barrels of crude oil. I think some of this information are not properly filtered. But finally, they are looking into these allegations, and I think I'm not defending myself because I was the president of the country within this period. I'm not defending myself, but what I know is that some of these figures I'm hearing are quite staggering. And those who know about what we earn, the number of states we have, and our states are not very strong, like American states. All the states almost depend on federal government. Very few states can pay salaries without income from the federal government. Very few states, maybe Lagos states. I can say even only Lagos states. Even River states and Kano states, that the internal general revenue is fairly high. Cannot pay salaries with the internal general revenue alone. It's only Lagos states, because of the level of industrialization within Lagos states. So these figures, yes, there are issues of corruption, no doubt about it, but not the level that has been painted. Then in terms of the AU, of course the issue of AU is history. Even ECOWAS before, the level of intervention was weak. If you follow the history of AU, it started as Organization of African Unity, and as at that time, African countries were just gaining independence. And one of the key things is that the Organization of African Unity then should not interfere with the internal affairs of any country. Of course, that's why even when we have the issue of genocide in Rwanda, AU then couldn't even do anything, because don't interfere with the internal affairs of any country. Genocide in Rwanda was an internal affair, and it was a very bad case. ECOWAS had these similar treaties. At the time ECOWAS was formed in Nigeria, Gowon was the head of state. It was General Gowon, who was the military head of state. So as at that time, the concept was patterned after the Organization of African Unity, now AU, and that we are just an economic bloc. We are not a political bloc. So internal affairs of the state remain the affairs of the state. But it's now we feel that economy cannot stand on a very shaky political foundation. So we must stabilize our states politically. And now we are interfering. Of course, the ECOWAS sub-region has almost been stabilized, very stable, like you know. And I think AU too is towing that pattern. But AU is a bigger organization. ECOWAS is a smaller organization. We have been successful because only 15 countries make up the ECOWAS. But AU is bigger and more complex than ECOWAS. The only difference in ECOWAS is that some of us are Francophone countries, some of us are Anglophone and true Lusophone. Otherwise, of course, Liberia is almost like Anglophone because of the America. It's only, of course, Map and America, they were liberated since 1847. So it's easier to manage ECOWAS. And I believe the other economic blocs too, the East African economic bloc is doing very well too. South African economic bloc is also doing very well. I think we have little problems within the Central African region. But I believe even that time we are going to get to